What makes a fight more than just fists and fury? What happens when a simple street brawl becomes a cultural phenomenon, one that reshaped arcades and gave birth to legends? In 1989, Capcom unleashed a game that wasn't just about beating up thugs on the mean streets of Metro City. It was about redefining what an arcade experience could feel like. But here's the mystery. How did a game originally pitched as Street Fighter 89 transform into Final Fight? Why did players line up for hours just to get a taste of it? And why decades later does this gritty brawler still hold special places in gaming history? Today, we're going back to Metro City to uncover the untold story behind Final Fight, the game that set the streets on fire. The year was 1988, and Capcom had a problem. Now, their first attempt at a fighting game, Street Fighter in 1987, had been ambitious but clunky. The massive arcade cabinet with its pressure-sensitive buttons looked impressive, there's no doubt about that, but it was kind of unreliable, expensive, and most importantly, the game just didn't catch fire. Competitors like Tecno's Japan Double Dragon had stolen the spotlight, making the beat-em-up genre the new draw in arcades. But Capcom didn't give up. Their executives decided to double down on the Street Fighter name anyway. After all, branding was everything, right? If Double Dragon could dominate, why couldn't Street Fighter's sequel reimagine itself as something bigger? And the pitch was simple: Street Fighter 89. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Street Fighter 89 wasn't a traditional one-on-one fighting game at all. Instead of duels, players would battle through waves of enemies across side-scrolling stages. The working title clung to the Street Fighter brand to ride most of its modest recognition, but the DNA was already completely different. Now, early location tests of Street Fighter 89 totally confused players. They walked up expecting another martial arts tournament, expecting to see Ryu or Ken in a new global showdown. Instead, they found themselves in a grimy city fighting off punks and gangsters in a co-op chaos. The branding mismatch was too strong, and audiences just couldn't connect the dots between Street Fighter and this new style of game. So Capcom quickly realized the truth. This wasn't Street Fighter at all. It wasn't even close. So rather than force the name onto new creation, they took a bold risk, dropping the brand entirely and giving it a fresh identity. The decision gave birth to Final Fight. And the name wasn't accidental. It was a direct signal. This wasn't a duel, it was an all-out war on the streets. And Capcom wanted players to feel they were stepping into the ultimate brawler experience, one that would stand apart from Double Dragon and cement Capcom as a powerhouse in the genre. And so, what could have been a forgotten misstep, an awkward Street Fighter spin-off, became something far greater. By severing the ties to the past, Capcom freed Final Fight to define its own future. And another thing to mention also as well, it was pretty bold of Capcom to cut that tie between Street Fighter and Final Fight, because a lot of people try to cash in, and just because they got a little bit of name recognition branding behind a game, they'll just slap something on and call it Part 2. But it was probably maybe a misstep or a happy accident for them to actually switch off and call it Final Fight, because I feel like that gives Final Fight franchise, it gave it the room to breathe and become its own thing. But it would be cool later on that it would come full circle, but we'll get to that later on in the video. Now, when Capcom's developers set out to transform Street Fighter 89 into something new, and when I'm talking about Street Fighter 89 now, I'm talking about Final Fight just being called Street Fighter 89. They weren't just chasing trends, they were working on a secret weapon, the CPS-1 arcade board. Now, the Capcom Play system launched in 1988 with their cutting-edge arcade hardware. Compared to the aging technology of competitors, the CPS-1 at the time was like a muscle car in a world of sedans. It could handle bigger sprites, brighter colors, smoother animations, and more complex backgrounds. And definitely, it was a game changer. And Final Fight would be its first true showcase of what it could do. So Yoshiki Okamoto, one of Capcom's most ambitious producers, understood arcades were theaters of spectacle. And kids didn't choose cabinets which ones they wanted to play based on subtle gameplay. They were drawn to flashing lights, booming soundtracks, and larger-than-life sprites. And that philosophy alone shaped every decision choice in making Final Fight. The characters weren't just bigger, they were massive compared to most other games at the time. And to me, the enemies had a little bit of flair as well. They weren't just generic punk rockers with neon hair, oversized bruisers. They were actually cool characters. And environments weren't static, they felt alive and they burst with urban grit, from city bars to crowded subways. And the development team wanted players to feel the game, not just play it. So the punches had a lot of weight, a lot of heft, the weapons had a good feel to them, and the soundtrack with the pounding bass matched the on-screen chaos. Now, as great as the CPS-1 hardware was, it still had constraints and had to make a few tough calls. Now, originally Capcom wanted 3-player co-op as opposed to 2. However, the CPS couldn't handle that many massive sprites and background layers without chugging. The compromise? Just do like most people wanted, make it 2-player co-op, but the characters are so bold and environment so alive, no one seemed to care at the time. So let's talk about the gameplay and mechanics. Now, this game wasn't like other brawlers at the time. Double Dragon introduced co-op combat, and they, don't get me wrong, Double Dragon definitely did a lot of firsts, so I have to say that before I say anything else. Double Dragon was definitely the inspiration for this game, but I think Final Fight in some ways took it to the next level. I mean, the sprites were so huge that each blow seemed to shake the screen, and when Hagar slammed the thug into the ground, it wasn't just a move, it was kind of a brand new moment, kind of mixing fighting with wrestling elements. Well, at least for Hagar anyway. Now, what made Final Fight revolutionary was its rhythm. I mean, the game wasn't just button mashing, it actually had a flow, and each character had a distinct style. So we have to compare it to Double Dragon, where Billy and Jimmy, or Spike and Hammer if you want to call them, they kind of had the same moves, and a lot of beat 'em up games back then had more than one character, but they had the same moveset. So Final Fight was actually one of the first games to actually have, each character have their own individual style that you could pick from. So that was kind of a big deal back in the day. So you had Cody, and that was the kind of the balanced brawler with rapid punches, a knee bash, and a grab that flowed into a finishing toss. And then you had Guy, which was the speedster of the bunch, and his martial arts combos let skilled players juggle enemies before they could even fight back. And lastly, like we mentioned before, you had Hagar, and he was slower but devastating, and his power driver could wipe out health bars and turn the tide in an instant. Now this game did have a combo system in a sense, but it wasn't like traditional combo systems like we got today. I mean, you would mash a couple of buttons, and the more times you mashed the buttons, you would finish out the combo. And it's fair to say Double Dragon kind of did the same thing, with the sense of you could push two buttons, and the last one would be the uppercut if you were pushing punch, and the kick button if you pushed two kicks to stun your opponent, and then you do that roundhouse kick at the end. So you can kind of say this was the same combo system that they had, but this one's a little more flashier. But overall, it wasn't a true combo system where you actually had to input different buttons. But it was a combo system, and it planted the seed. For the first time, brawlers felt like they actually had a combat language. And then there were the mechanics of the games. So veterans of Final Fight learned Cody and Guy could effectively trap enemies in the stun loop, preventing them from even fighting back. So if you don't know what that is, and I'm not gonna lie, when I first played Final Fight back in the day, I didn't know about the stun loop combo. I didn't figure that out until they brought Cody back in Alpha 3, and I was kind of curious why he do that one super he had where he jab you twice, turn around, jab you again. If you didn't know that from Final Fight, it just looked like a stupid super, because I was kind of, when I saw it, I was kind of like, this is the dumbest super ever, where he just kind of hits you a couple times, turns around. But it's actually genius because it's a throwback to Final Fight. Now, if you knew about Final Fight's infinite jab loops, then it would make total sense to you. So I'll explain it to you real quick. And basically, it's real simple, dude, and I'll give you a few examples, because later on in this video, we're going to look at the ports of Final Fight, a lot of the ports, and this is where I gauge it to see if it's really a true port to Final Fight in some ways, if they can do the jab loop. If you can do the jab loop in your game, your version of Final Fight, that makes you, in my mind, one step closer to the arcade. So basically what you would do is you'd hit the punch button twice, and you had to do it you had to mash it. You had to mash the button pretty quick. So you mash the button real quick, pull the joystick away, and pull back. So basically, in a sense, what you do is you punch the person twice, punch the air, and then turn around and punch again. And if you do it fast enough, you'll stun lock the character. Guys was a little bit different. You could do 3 buttons with him sometimes, or 2. It was your choice. But so that was pretty much the way to drain an enemy's life bar, even bosses as well. And I'll show you in a few examples right here while we keep talking. So first, let's look at Cody's jab loop. And by timing his rapid punches just right, Cody could keep thugs in an endless chain, locking them in place, whittling down their health. And if you have the rhythm, because that's one of the things, guys, you have to do. It's not, you can't just mash. You have to have a little bit of rhythm as well. You can basically go through the game without being hit, and that's next to impossible to do, but it is possible. And then you had Guy's. His speed made him lethal as well, and he had the quick strikes and could juggle enemies, and he also had a stun loop combo as well. He also had a wall dive, and a lot of people don't use that, but yes, he actually did have a wall dive as well. Now, again, like most older games, these discoveries weren't intended by Capcom, but they gave players a taste of mastery. So suddenly it wasn't just about mashing buttons, it was about learning timing, spacing, and control. And once again, that philosophy echoed forward in future games. Because in just 2 years, Capcom would unleash Street Fighter II, and the idea of moves linking together, combos will explode in a new genre. And much like Final Fight, we know Capcom Street Fighter II, those combos were accidental, just like this game. So that's one thing to note with Street Fighter. Street Fighter II, I should say, it didn't have, combos weren't meant to be in the game. That's why with Street Fighter II, when you do a 3-hit combo or something like that, there's no scaling. All of it registers as one hit, and that's why the damage is so high in Street Fighter 2. That was something that the fans discovered on accident. So yeah, but it wasn't meant to put in the games until later iterations. I think the first one that would really adopt that would be Super Street Fighter 2, where it actually had a combo meter, or not meter, but a combo notification saying once you've done a combo. So that's when it kind of became, more combo friendly. But for the original Street Fighter 2, Champion Edition and Turbo would actually have the homemade combos, if you will. But Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition and beyond did scale down the damage in that because they were aware of it, so they scaled the damage. So your combos didn't hit as hard in Turbo and Champion Edition. But back to Final Fight. So one thing with this game, you weren't facing one opponent, you were battling waves of enemies from all sides. And that was made this game pretty tough if you're playing it by yourself. It designed you kind of have to, even though you had those, instant hands where you could like clear out enemies, you still have to think like a tactician to see where your enemies were on the screens. And there's a couple of ways, it even had a little bit of depth to it. You can clear out the weaker punks first, or you could take risks to drop like the big brutes like Andores in the game. And you could use your weapons as well. So basically it had a couple of ways you can play it. And the game, in my opinion, it was brutally difficult. I mean, it was basically a quarter muncher machine, and enemies swarmed in overwhelming numbers. And this, like most arcades, designed to drain your pockets of quarters. But at the time, players didn't mind. I mean, the challenge wasn't survival, it was endurance. And when I say endurance, I mean how much money did you have? Because I mean, yeah, they could drain your life pretty quick. Hits hurt on this game. So I guess the real question would be, could you and your buddy clear Metro City before your allowance ran out? That was the real question. And another thing that this game had as well, you actually had a super move where it cost you a little bit of energy. You hit both buttons at the same time. Your player will do, it depending on which character you got, it'll be a kind of a get off me move. You can do it by itself and not hit anybody. It won't take any damage, but once you hit somebody, it takes off a little sliver of your life. And that was pretty cool at the time because Final Fight was one of the first games to do that, to give you a super move. Because you can imagine playing Double Dragon and every time you do the elbow, you lose a little bit of life. I mean, it'd be a little tougher to get through that game, but this was kind of an initial saying to get it because you need that move for damage control. Another thing I'll add while I'm thinking about it is this game, what sucks with this game is an arcade, you can pay your way to the end. You can keep putting enough money and you'll beat it. On home versions though, this game was pretty tough, especially the Super Nintendo version, because you only had one player. It was one player for some reason, but we'll get to that later on in the video. And the enemies come out fast and it's a ton of them. It doesn't take much to kill you in this game and you only got limited continues. So it was kind of a big deal to beat Final Fight by yourself because it was just like, all these enemies on the screen, each one takes damage, and you need to make this game survive. To make this game make sense, you have to have two people playing it. That makes the most sense. But one player, you can possibly do it, but just know it's going to be a hard road. So let's talk about the world story of Final Fight. Now, when Final Fight dropped players in the Metro City, it wasn't just using faceless waves of thugs. It was a crime drama in pixel art, a pulp comic brought to life. And the premise was simple but powerful. The Mad Gear gang had seized control of the city, and when they kidnapped Mayor Hagar's daughter, Jessica, it sparked an all-out war. Now, yeah, pretty simple setting, capture the damsel, and we're gonna save her. So pretty much you weren't really fighting for glory here, you were fighting to save Jessica and clean up the streets. I mean, every beat 'em up game has characters, but Final Fight kind of has some iconic characters, and these characters would go on to star in many of Capcom's games. So we'll go over the cast real quick of the characters that were in Final Fight. So first up, we'll talk about the heroes of Metro City. You had Mike Hagar, a retired pro wrestler turned mayor, and Hagar was like anything else in games at the time. A politician who pile drove criminals through the pavement. I mean, yeah, it was a little absurd at the time, but brilliant and definitely unforgettable. And Hagar became so iconic. He also appeared in multiple Final Fight sequels. He also made appearances in Slam Masters, that was a wrestling game spinoff by Capcom, Marvel's Capcom 3, and his meme-worthy status of the mayor who suplexes crime makes him one of Capcom's most beloved cult heroes. So definitely Capcom, I want to say that's where they got, and maybe where they got some inspiration for Zangief with the spinning pile driver, maybe. But yeah, Hagar showed up in a ton of games, so definitely would have life after this series of Final Fight. And next up we had Cody Travers, and Cody's probably my favorite of the three. I mean, he's the everyman hero, jeans, t-shirt, street brawler to save his girlfriend Jessica. And Cody as well, his story just didn't end in Final Fight. Years later, Capcom brought him back in Alpha 3, but with a twist this time, and that's what gave Cody a little more depth. Delusional Cody became a convict and fighting in handcuffs and prison garb, and it was at the time, it was a big twist because I mean, he was a big hero back in the day, and it was a dark, kind of fascination reinvention of the character that showed Capcom's willingness to evolve. And Cody would go on as well to be in Street Fighter 4, and that was my main character I used back in the day. I'll get to that whenever we cover Street Fighter 4 in the future. But yeah, Cody was a cool character. And then Cody also had more depth in my mind than the rest of the characters because it was also another game, Final Fight for the PS2, and we'll look at that game later a little bit. And Cody had a whole darker side and a breakdown where it didn't even seem like the same guy. He was kind of like drinking all the time and kind of just, when I say badass, no, I mean he was a bad guy. He kind of wasn't living a healthy lifestyle. So yeah, and that was a whole story. He had a brother and everything like that. So yeah, it was Cody kind of takes a deep dive where he's good at the beginning, kind of goes if you stay with the Capcom storyline as far as in fighting games and stuff, he kind of goes bad. And then even in Street Fighter V, he'd make another reappearance there where he actually will become the mayor of Metro City as well. So Cody's had quite the roller coaster, but we'll move on to the next character. And then you had Guy, the speedy martial artist, a student of ninjutsu. Guy became a fan favorite for his style and agility, and this is speedster, like I said. And he too crossed over into the Alpha series as a playable character, and he carried the torch from Metro City into Capcom's fighting game universe. And yeah, Guy's kind of been around as well. He was in Street Fighter 4. He really didn't make he didn't make a reappearance in Street Fighter 5, but they did have representation of him with, I mean, you could say Zeku in some kind of ways if you never played Street Fighter 5 before. And then you had Street Fighter 6, you have Kimberly, and she kind of fights with that same ninjutsu style. So yeah, his representation's there, but he only appeared in Street Fighter Alpha 3, and the whole Alpha series. He's in all Alphas, and he appeared in Street Fighter 4. So yeah, but his style is represented in later Street Fighter games as well. So personality-wise, you know, like a stoic ninja would be. And then you had Jessica Hagar, and though not a playable character, she was basically the damsel in distress who motivated the entire story. Her kidnapping by the Mad Gear was the spark that ignited the war basically in Metro City. And Jessica would later cameo in sequels and Capcom lore, and though never achieving the prominence of Cody, Guy, or Hagar, she's definitely a part of the series. So yeah. Next, we'll move on to the villains and bosses of Metro City. And a lot of these will reappear as well. Now, if you have the main boss, Belgar, wheelchair-bound gang lord perched in his penthouse, firing a crossbow at his heroes. And his absurdity and menace made him memorable, at least to the Final Fight series. And he even reappeared in Final Fight Revenge and Final Fight Streetwise. So yeah, you would see him again later on down the road. And then we had Sodom, Mad Gear Lieutenant, who wore full samurai gear despite being an American otaku obsessed with Japanese culture. And Sodom would later graduate to a Street Fighter Alpha series as a playable fighter wielding dual katanas in competitive matches. And another note with Sodom, he'd be one of the characters that gets censored because of his name, of course. And in the US, they'd call him Katana. But in Street Fighter series, he was named Sodom as well. But you know, at the time, censorship was kind of heavy, so they would change his name to Katana, but one and the same character. And then you had one of the more popular characters of the bad guys, Rolento. And this was another lieutenant. Rolento was a military extremist with grenades and tactical flair. And like Sodom, Rolento was resurrected in the Street Fighter Alpha series and became a cult favorite among hardcore players. Now, just a little bit about Rolento. He came out, this first appearance would be, I want to say Alpha 2, and he was in Alpha 3 as well. And then he would go on to Street Fighter 4. He'd reappear there. He'd be in Street Fighter Cross Tekken, and definitely a fan favorite with his multi-hits. Pretty agile character, you know, so pretty much he had his own style of gameplay. And also, I want to point out, and maybe you guys, I don't know, if you watch Hokuto Shinken, Fist of the North Star, he reminds me of the Psy Colonel. And this was a Fist of the North Star character. He practiced Nanto Seiken, which is, and this is a whole nother conversation for another time, but he was a Nanto Seiken practitioner, and he used the silent killing fist. And basically what he did was he had the patch. He looked a lot, I put the pictures up here. He looked a lot like Rolento. I have to think this is where they got Rolento's inspiration from, God's Army. But yeah, if you like Hokuto Shinken, you'll know what I'm talking about. If not, find out, because it's definitely a good series to watch. And moving along, we got Andor, and this was a towering grappler clearly inspired by pro wrestling legend Andre the Giant. And Andor would appear in Final Fight, and pretty much every Final Fight entry, and even as background characters in multiple Street Fighter titles. Now, this guy's weird, and this guy has a lot of lore as well. He would later be known to most people as Hugo, and Hugo would appear in a lot of games. Basically, Street Fighter 3 Double Impact would be his first appearance, and then he'd go on to Third Strike. He's probably most infamous for Third Strike, most known for Third Strike. And then you'd have Street Fighter 4, he'd appear there, and he'd also be in Street Fighter Cross Tekken. And basically, this guy is hugely inspired by Andre the Giant. There's no denying that. He looks just like Andre the Giant. And you have Andore Jr. and all these different versions, but basically I think of Hugo. But when I hear the word Andore, I think of Final Fight. So that's kind of a background with that guy. And he was homies with Poison. And next up, we got probably the most controversial characters of all, Poison and Roxy. And no characters in Final Fight have sparked more debate than Poison and Roxy. The female Mad Gear gang members. In the Japanese arcade release, they were designed as tough, whip-wielding punk women. But when Final Fight was ported to the Super Nintendo in the early 90s, Nintendo of America had strict censorship policies that intervened. Now, Nintendo at the time did not allow violence against women in their games, and to avoid controversy, Poison and Roxy were replaced by palette swap male characters named Sid and Billy in the US versions. But I don't really know if that's true because I know Double Dragon for the NES, you could actually punch Linda in the face, and there was like Renegade, you could, Mr. K, you could actually punch the women in that game. So I don't really think it was more about beating up women. I think it was just they used that excuse because if you look at Roxy and Poison, they were pretty much, look like streetwalkers in that game. And I guess they wouldn't want to do that because you could look at Renegade as well. If you play the arcade Renegade, the females in there look a little more risque as opposed to when you fight the ones on NES version, they got the skirts and they look a little different. So they're a lot more risque. If you ever play Renegade in arcade and can get to level 3, you'll see that those women are a lot more like women of the night as opposed to what they are in the NES version. I think the same thing happened here with Final Fight. And just know that some of the changes that came from Capcom, a lot of people embraced it, and other people thought that it was just a way from the retcon, the censorship they put in the game. So yeah, kind of confusing, but regardless, Poison became iconic. She later graduated to Street Fighter 3 as a background character and eventually became a fully playable fighter in Street Fighter X, Cross Tekken, and Ultra Street Fighter 4. And in many ways, she transcended her original enemy thug status and became one of Capcom's most recognizable characters. And that's not the only game she'd be in. There was a Final Fight game, there was a fighting game, we'll cover it later, for the Sega Saturn and arcade as well, where Poison was actually a playable character in that game as well. And we'll take a quick peek when we get to that part of the video. So let's talk about Roxy, because often she gets left behind, and Roxy, her palette swap counterpart to Poison, never reached the same fame, but she still remains part of the lore for diehard fans. So as far as level design goes, each level of Final Fight wasn't just a stage, it was a chapter in the narrative. The neon-lit streets set the tone for corruption, the subway tunnels reflected the rot beneath the city, and industrial areas showcased the game's grip on Metro City's economy. And the penthouse, that's the final showdown and the pure crime drama pulp. So unlike many arcade games that just loop endlessly, Final Fight felt like a journey, and Double Dragon, in my opinion, did the same thing. Players weren't just chasing a high score, they were fighting for Metro City's soul. So let's talk about the launch and impact of Final Fight. Now at the time, arcades were a competitive ecosystem. I mean, if one place had Double Dragon, another place needed Golden Axe or Renegade or something like that. And when Final Fight arrived, it was basically the cabinet to get. And arcades scrambled to secure it because whoever had Final Fight at that time in 1989 drew the biggest crowds. So at long last, Capcom had finally found this tentpole brawler, something that stood out in that realm. And reviewers called it a graphical marvel, the scale of the characters, the fluidity of animations, and the sheer sense of impact to a new standard. So if Double Dragon was proof of a concept, Final Fight was the genre's coming of age. And that led to a string of games back in the day. You had that, the beat 'em up boom would lead to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the arcade game, The Simpsons, and Sega doubled down with Streets of Rage in that genre. And Final Fight was at the center of it all in 1989. And the game was, it did a good job and was supposed to. They basically drained your pockets. I mean, with the AI swarming you aggressively, Rolento and Abigail and all them people, swiping off big chunks of energy. I mean, players didn't see it as unfair though. They saw it as a challenge to their skills and, like we said earlier, their wallets. And that's another character I forgot to mention, good old Abigail. He'd be in that game as well, and he'd appear in Street Fighter V. So yeah, he was another one to kind of go under the radar for a while. So there was one limitation with the game. The arcade game was so big and colorful that it belonged to the arcades, and kids couldn't take the arcade game home with you. So as the console market heated up, the demand for arcade perfect ports grew louder, and Capcom knew they had too big of a hit to keep locked away in the coin-op machines. So if Final Fight was going to cement itself as more than just an arcade marvel, it had to make the jump to our living rooms. And that decision would spark its own story, a story of compromises, censorships, missing features, and the internal struggle of early 1990s consoles trying to live up to the arcade experience. So right now we're going to go ahead and take a look at some of the Final Fight ports they made, and some of them are actually pretty good, some of them are pretty bad, and then we'll look at a couple of the spin-offs. So if we go over every Final Fight game, this video will be like super long, but we'll go over the ones that are most mentionable. So let's go ahead and jump into it. So first up, we got Final Fight for the arcade, and this one needs no introduction. This was a cool game right here. Basically, you can see how big the sprites are, the movement is smooth in it, and it did have like little glitches you can do, like this part right here, you can jump on the barrels and wait for the enemies to clear out. And this game, like I said earlier, it was tough because it was just, if you were playing it by yourself, like I'm doing here, the game can be overwhelming at times. But overall, this is what the game should look like, and this was the classic that went down in history. So definitely good showing here. And next up, we'll take a look at Final Fight for the Amiga, and the game looks pretty good. I mean, it looks great. The problem with this game is, though, it's not as fast paced. The movement can be a little choppy, but yeah, I can go with that. It's not too bad. The only problem with the game is that their punches come out slow. So in this version of the game, you don't have the infinite jabs. And the game can be a little clunky trying to play with one button. But at the same time, you play with the mouse and keyboard, you might get a better experience. But I feel like some of the characters are in different places. Like this guy shouldn't be here. The guy running across, he shouldn't be in this stage yet. But overall, I feel like it's a decent attempt. And this game can be hard because they can kind of gang up on you and stun lock you. You can use your super get off me move, but yeah. But overall, not bad. The movement's good. The graphics are good. It's just a pretty tough version of the game to play. And next up, we got Final Fight for the Sega CD. And this is probably, in my opinion, one of the best versions of the game. But this one's actually a pretty dope version. It looks pretty much spot on with the arcade. Sounds like the arcade. The graphics are slightly lesser, but for what it is, I mean, I feel like it's probably, in my opinion, one of the best ports of it you can get. And here, obviously, the rapid hands work, your infinite combos work, and overall, pretty good representation here. The music's spot on, the crowd controls like it's supposed to be, enemies appear in the right spot. So yeah, this is definitely one of the definitive ways to play this game. So good job with the Sega CD. And then we got Final Fight 1 for the Game Boy Advance, and believe it or not, this is actually a pretty cool version of it. I mean, it does sacrifice a little bit of the graphics from the arcade, but overall, for Game Boy Advance, this actually looks pretty cool. The movement of the game is pretty good. The speed of the game's on point. And yeah, rapid hands do work in this game as well. You could play this game with a link cable as well. You could play 2 players if you had a link cable for it. So yeah, overall, this is a really good representation of Final Fight on the go. This one is, even at a later stage when Game Boy Advance came out, you still don't get Roxy and Poison in the Nintendo version. So this is, in my mind, based more off the Super NES version. So yeah, but overall, still a good representation on the Game Boy Advance. And then probably one of the most controversial versions is the Super NES version, which looks beautiful, by the way. A very good successor, a very good version of the game compared to the arcade. I mean, graphics are on point, the game moves pretty fast and smooth, and the characters are where they're supposed to be. But this is the edited version where instead of getting Roxy and Poison, you get Sid and this other guy. And yeah, I mean, other than that, I can't say. The main problem with this game is not so much the censorship, it's the fact that it's only one player, because all the other versions for the most part had 2 players. This one, and that was a big thing. I don't understand why they did this back in the day with this game, because at that point, I mean, the system was capable of running 2 players. I mean, because it would do it in later Final Fight games with 2-player Final Fights. And then they made the one in Japan, Final Fight Guy, because Guy was missing in this game. So he wasn't even in the game. That's another part. You had Hagar and Cody. You couldn't play 2 players, and one of the main characters were missing. So I don't know if they were trying to rush and get this game out or what the story behind it was. But then you got the Japanese version that will come over here later and be called Final Fight Guy, where Cody's missing, and you got Guy and Hagar, and it's still just 1 player. So yeah, I never understood that, but that was a big letdown back in the day for people who loved the arcade version of Final Fight and then try to play it on the home version with beautiful graphics and looking superb like the Super Nintendo one does, but only be 1 player. So yeah, that was kind of a big deal, and it kind of hurt Final Fantasy on the Super Nintendo. But you know, other than that though, as far as gameplay and everything with the game, it's pretty spot on point with the alterations with the censorship. That's one thing, but other than that, gameplay is flawlessly like the arcade did. So pretty much, if you can get past the 1-player part, being 1 player only, or if you don't have friends and it didn't matter anyway, then this is probably a good port, and probably the most famous port that most people got, unless you had a Sega and you played the Sega CD version. But yeah, this was basically a lot of people's first introduction to the home console version of Final Fight. And then you had a cool one I thought was Mighty Final Fight for the NES, and this was actually pretty cool because you had you had all 3 characters. You had Cody, you had Guy, you had Hagar, and they each had their own moves, and it kind of had in some ways a little bit of a RPG elements, because you had that little bar at the bottom, and the further you got in the game, that bar would fill up and you get your special move. And you had a nice combo system. It had bonus stages in it and everything, and it didn't like play exactly like the arcade, but for what it was, I mean, I thought it was a pretty fun game. Hop in, have some fun real quick, and it actually brought back a lot of the characters from the Final Fight as well. So yeah, this is overall kind of different from the standard Final Fight game that we play in the arcades, but overall though, still a good addition to the Final Fight family. So yeah, if you never played Mighty Final Fight for the NES, definitely give this one a shot. It's short, but pretty fun, so definitely give this one a shot. So shout outs to Mighty Final Fight. So next up, we got Final Fight Revenge, and this was that fighting game I was telling you about. This game was actually an arcade, and they also had a Sega Saturn version for this as well. And it was actually pretty cool. The moves were a little different, and this one definitely went under the radar. I remember they had this, the first time I saw this game, actually saw it and played it, was actually at Combo Breaker. Well, it wasn't called Combo Breaker from Chicago, the fighting game tournament. It was actually called UFGT Tournament at the time, Ultimate Fighting Game Tournament. This was back in 2013 timeframe. And if you're familiar with that, if you're from the Chicagoland area, or if you just travel to fighting game tournaments, you'll know that UFGT was infamous for the mystery games. And mystery game would be pretty much any game you want to play that has versus in it. So to make a long story short, that was my first time actually playing this game. So I went back and played it, and it does have a lot of the OG Final Fight characters. I mean, you had Rolento, you had Poison, and it actually has some pretty cool special moves. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that this is like tournament level play of gameplay, but for what it is, I mean, because it was a kind of a cool concept. You could pick, kind of like, think of it like Street Fighter meets Power Stone in a sense. You could pick up all these weapons, and then you could use weapons. You had guns, you had boxes, crates you could throw, and each person had a bunch of super moves. So it's actually a cool experience. I'm not going to sit here and say it's going to blow you out the water or anything, but for what it was, it's actually pretty cool. So yeah, if you ever get a chance, check out Final Fight Revenge. And we'll close it up with one of the more modern versions of Final Fight, Final Fight Streetwise. And this one was on the PlayStation 2. I believe it was on the OG Xbox as well. But this is what I was talking about, where Cody kind of takes a turn for the worse. He's kind of going through some stuff at the time, and this game was kind of a commercial flop, but I loved it. And like I said, that's my take on it. I mean, a lot of people are probably gonna say the game sucks or whatever, but I thought it was actually pretty cool. But it was around this time frame when PlayStation was doing a lot of reboots with, the older games like Shinobi, Alter Beast, Final Fight. They had a lot of franchises branch off on there, and this one was actually pretty cool. It was time-based. It was a Street Fighter brawl kind of, so it was kind of a sandboxy kind of game, and you had RPG elements. You can go through the storyline. For the most part, yeah, this was a pretty cool experience. And again, this is one to go back on the PS2 and play. The controls were a little clunky at the time, but if you got used to the controls, the actual game was actually pretty good. And the fight scenes were pretty good. They had slowdown motion, they had counters and stuff like that. So they had a story mode where you could run around and pick up stuff and do quests. So yeah, this was actually a pretty cool game. So if you ever get a chance, check this one out. You might be disappointed, you might not be disappointed, I don't know, but definitely a pretty cool game and a part of Final Fight history. So yeah. So the story of Final Fight is one definitely of evolution. Born as Street Fighter 89 and rejected as a sequel that didn't fit, it found its own identity, and in doing so became the blueprint for an entire genre. It taught Capcom how to make combat visceral, how to make characters larger than life, and how to turn simple brawls into cultural moments. And the heroes of Metro City, they didn't just stay confined to one cabinet. Hagar, Cody, Guy, Poison, Rolento, and Sodom all found second lives in sequels, spin-offs, in the Street Fighter universe itself. That's how it came full circle. And they became more than just sprites. They became at least Capcom icons in their own right. And then you had the controversy of Poison and Roxy, censored, debated, reimagined, and proven just how games weren't about entertainment, but reflections of cultures clashing with boundaries of censorship and identity. And in that sense, Final Fight wasn't only about fists, it was about conversations that still echo to this day. And then came the ports. Each one told a different story. The stripped down Super NES version showed the compromises of an early home console, and the Sega CD and Sharp 68000 versions proved fidelity was possible. Final Fight 1 showed that handhelds could honor the past with new love. And Streetwise, some people say it's flawed and messy, misunderstood at times, but proof that even after decades, Capcom still believed in Metro City's streets and they were worth revisiting. So Final Fight wasn't perfect. It was brutal, unfair at times, quarter hungry, and sometimes controversial. But maybe that's exactly why it stuck. They reflected the chaos of a city on the brink and gave us the power to take it back, if nothing but one pile driver at a time. So what I think about Final Fight? Final Fight was a cool game. I feel like you had Double Dragon at the time, back in a couple of years before that, and then Double Dragon kind of started that whole beat 'em up genre in my mind, the OG of beat 'em up games, and Final Fight just came and did everything louder. It was a great game. It introduced a lot of new mechanics as far as the get off me move mechanic. I mean, you can kind of maybe say the elbow from Double Dragon was that, but that's not what it was designed for. This one was designed in earnest to be a get off me move, and they were the first game that I saw that would take a little bit of life, so you couldn't spam that get off remove. And this would go into later games like Cadillacs and Dinosaurs and games like that, or just a lot of Neo Geo fighters or beat 'em up games that this would go on. And then you'd actually had a difference between Double Dragon and this game would be Double Dragon, Billy and Jimmy, or Spike and Hammer, however you want to address them. They would have the same sprites and be the same characters. So if you played in player 1 and 2, you kind of had the same moveset, but this would give Final Fight would give each character a new fighting kit, so they could do stuff. You had the Brawler, and it kind of was the first one to adopt the Speedster, the Brawler, and then the in-between guys. So they kind of started that thing. I'll kick that off, if you will. At least in my mind, it did. And then you had, the characters. A lot of the characters were iconic, and they'd go on to star in their own games and newer games, and then join that whole Capcom universe. And they brought back quite a few games, quite a few characters. Capcom, especially in Street Fighter games, they're synonymous with bringing back characters from the past. So yeah, they pretty much every character in the game, besides Belger, and he's been the boss here. He really didn't get a lot of airtime. A little bit in other Final Fight related games, but as far as fighting games, not so much. But in the other fighting universe, you had all the Metro City Heroes. They were in crossover games. Hagar, they were in wrestling games. They more Street Fighter fighting games, arcade games, and just everywhere in pop culture. And I think Capcom was smart to reuse their IPs, because they were definitely, you see them here in their roughest forms, but as time goes on, they'd get a lot better looking with details and graphics and stuff like that. So overall, Final Fight was definitely one of those games, a beat 'em up game that solidified its dominance in that space, at least in 1989. And definitely never forgotten with all the remakes of Final Fight. You had Final Fight 2, Final Fight 3, and they would introduce new characters. They'd have a lot of those characters. Some of the newer characters would pop up in the CVS 2 game and stuff like that. A lot of them would make their way to Street Fighter 5. So even the spin-off characters would go on to have their own thing, but that's Final Fight 2 and Final Fight 3. But overall, that's going to do it for Final Fight 1, the original OG. But let me know your experiences in the comments. Did you like Final Fight? Did you play Final Fight? I mean, what did you think about the censorship policies? Until, like I said, Nintendo did play it safe back in the day, but the characters still, you still got the same good experience. Or if you played some of the other spin-offs, as far as Street Fighter Alpha series with the characters, or did you think it was just a Double Dragon knockoff? I thought it was pretty cool overall. I thought it was a game that brought a lot of new things to the table at the time. So yeah, that's gonna do it, guys. And as always, take care of yourself, protect your inner peace. God bless you. Catch you next video. Thanks for watching.